Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Political Forum. It's good to see everyone. Tonight's event is entitled Occupy Wall Street, Its Impact and Legacy 10 Years Later. Here's an excerpt of the event description. 10 years ago this week, a group of protesters descended at Zuccotti Park in Manhattan's financial district. As we mark the 10th anniversary of Occupy, we'll take a critical look at its influence and impact in our society today. Therefore, let's look back and discuss the following points. Occupy's contribution to the ideas and people that influence today's progressive agenda, from the 99% mantra to the presidential candidacy of Bernie Sanders, to the rise of Justice Democrats to the fight for 15. Next, its distinct organizational activities and processes, such as the consensus-based decision-making process in the General Assemblies, and occupying, and I'm using air quotes there, an encampment of public space. Third, what were the originally intended goals of Occupy? In what ways have they achieved those goals? In what ways have they failed? Next, do you agree with the common criticisms leveled at OWS? In what ways did the movement appear radical, and did the protesters become extremist, if at all? Is Occupy's ideological and organizational counterpart the Tea Party on the right? And depending on how many people we have tonight as attendees, if we do split up into the breakout room session, that will be the question for us to further discuss. And then the final point is we're going to come back and we're going to look at kind of the legacy of this movement. So just like other political movements, has Occupy morphed into yet another catch-all partisan leaning movement, yet with no coherent ideology? How did Occupy give rise to other political movements in the past several years? So those are some of the questions that are posted on our Meetup page. Before we get into it, I just want to establish the framework in which how we are looking at Occupy. And before I get into the framework, I think the one big takeaway from tonight's discussion is this: whether if we agree with or support Occupy or not, that's certainly you're entitled to your own views, but political movements come and go. And there's a reason why political movements gain traction and momentum. And they start because certain conditions on the ground compel them to mobilize. And they usually start out due to certain grievances, especially during the times of economic hardship. And we've seen this throughout not just US history, but world history. And as these organizations or movements grow into what I consider the big tent effect, and what that means is more and more members or protesters or activists join these movements. As they grow bigger, we kind of see an expansion of viewpoints and priorities. Now, sometimes when these organizations grow, they lose their sense of purpose, their message gets diluted. Sometimes they change directions or shift their priorities. Other times they get co-opted. And what that means is another subset of folks come into the organization and they kind of dilute the message. Sometimes these movements, it gets co-opted by certain lobbying or corporate interests. And we've seen this time and time again. And when the dust settles, we look at ourselves and say, okay, we saw this phenomenon happen, whether if it's Occupy or other political movements such as the Tea Party, BLM. What was this all about? And what is the impact and legacy that these movements had? So that's really what we're trying to get at tonight. The other thing I'll mention is, because we try to approach these subjects from a kind of a nonpartisan angle, I would explain our discussion tonight in this fashion. Imagine if you're taking a poli-sci class as an undergraduate student, and this would be something equivalent to like a 200 level poli-sci class. And why is it a 200 level as opposed to 100 level? Because the assumption is that most of you have some basic understandings of the foundational principles of political forces and movements, and what the mood of the country was, and etc. So that's covered usually in the basic introductory 100 level courses. By the time you get to the 200 level courses, then you kind of apply the basic foundational principles to the current context or the historical context. And that's kind of what we're trying to do tonight, is look at this movement. What propelled them to mobilize? What were the forces? And what's their overall legacy? Now, we will try to do this more in a chronological fashion instead of just kind of going back and forth. So before we get to like how Occupy started in downtown Manhattan, we try to kind of look at things in a more broad view, not just looking at what happened in September 2011, but I think if we really want to get to the heart of what sparked this movement, I think the kind of the opening salvo is 2008 financial crisis. And that's probably the right place to start. And if anyone wants to chime in and have other ideas, feel free to raise your hand. Or right now we have a pretty small group, so I think you could just kind of speak out if you want to. So, 2008 was certainly a watershed moment because we had the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. So what's the fallout of the 2008 financial crisis? Well, we had record foreclosures, we've had bankruptcies, we've had job losses. We were almost teetering on the edge of a global depression. Whether if you agree with the government response, that's certainly a whole nother subject, but that's really kind of the starting point. And some of the other, I guess, factors that come into play is that there was also earlier that year in 2011, there was the Arab Spring. Now, I'm not sure if Arab Spring is directly related to what gave rise to Occupy Wall Street, but certainly some of the factors are interesting to look at. Like, for instance, what started the Arab Spring in early 2011? Well, it was a street vendor by the name of Mohammed Bouazizi, who basically he burned himself, self-immolation. And I think the common misconception is that the Arab Spring was people's discontent for their political system. I think that's true. And I think later on in the Arab Spring, like in places like Egypt, we did see a toppling of a very authoritarian regime in the name of governmental reform. But if you look at the initial starting point of the Arab Spring, was you have this street vendor who was frustrated because of the lack of economic opportunities that he was suffering from. So I think that's kind of like the underlying tension going into this year. And by 2011, we were certainly still in the trenches of the recovery from the 2008 market crash. There was a lot of uncertainties and jitters, both on Wall Street and Main Street. The other important thing is around this time, especially in the European nations, there were these massive austerity programs. And nations like the UK, Germany, Spain, they were also suffering from the economic crisis. So I think the trend back then was for these governments to simply reduce governmental spending, which means also reduction in government services and other programs that its citizens rely on. In fact, there was a movement in Spain called the Indignato Movement that was has some similarities or overlap to Occupy. So we have that going on at the time. And just politically speaking, I think those on the progressive left, I think they were disappointed with then President Obama. Again, he came in with this very idealistic hope and change. And by 2011, by the time Occupy gets going, we're already in the re-election cycle of the 22 presidential election. And a lot of the progressive activists voiced their dissatisfaction to the Obama administration. Because if you look at his members of his cabinet and his close advisors, well, they all came from Wall Street, starting from Tim Geithner, who was the the economic advisor, all the way down. So there was this kind of sense that, well, something should have happened in the wake of the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Yet President Obama surrounded himself with those Wall Street insiders. So that's also going on. In addition to that, going back to the 2008 market crash, the banks got bailed out, but what about the rest of us? So high level of resentment. And I think the final factor we should certainly look into is the role of technology. Social media played a big role, both in the Arab Spring and also in Occupy. And I think this is, by this period, Web 2.0, the advent of the apps that many of us use every day became an everyday ubiquitous function in our lives. And that helped us mobilize, spread the message, and disseminate. And again, this happened with the Tea Party movement, with Occupy, and also was very prevalent in some of the other international movements, such as the Arab Spring. So these are all the kind of the confluence of factors going into 2011, September. But see, I think most people have a misconception that something must have happened on September 17th, is I think when the protesters all gathered at the Zuccotti Park. But in fact, there were other kind of, indications of what's to come, because there were, I think May of 2011, there was another protest outside of the city hall, and the protesters were expressing a grievance against then Mayor Bloomberg because of certain reduction in government services like public schools. And I guess that's the other important thing too, is that politically speaking, by 2011, this would have been the third term of Mayor Bloomberg. The first two terms of Mayor Bloomberg, I think most historians will say he was pretty popular. But I think by the time we get into the third term, especially those final years, he was a lame duck mayor. And I think people really had this kind of a three-term fatigue that you commonly see with three-term mayors in New York City, like Mayor Koch. So those are all the factors kind of at play now. So why don't we open it up to others? Again, let's try to have the conversation flow in a chronological manner. So does anyone remember Occupy? Has anyone gone down to Zuccotti Park during that time? Feel free to chime in, folks. Yeah, go ahead. All right, hello.
Hi there. How are you? It was kind of funny thinking back on that period. I worked for American Express, and I worked down in the financial district right across from Zuccotti Park. And my memory of it was that there was a lot of hostility against the banks. As you'd mentioned, the banks had been bailed out. I subsequently then went to work at AIG, which was too big to be, too big to fail. I think there was just a lot of resentment against the banks and about how a lot of people had lost their homes during the housing crisis, or rather the economic crisis of 2009. And it was just like the average, that sentiment that the average person was not able to do anything that the rich people could. And I think that that was very much the sentiment of the Tunisian guy that couldn't get a license, just to have a little kiosk or a stall in the marketplace. I mean, it kind of was the same theme. And I tend to think that these things are somewhat related, because economic situations like this do drive people to do kind of extreme things, and the frustration boils over. So I think that those things are somewhat connected. I wish I could think of all the things across the world that were happening at the same time. I think it was a little early for the Syrian refugee crisis yet, but certainly those things do connect up in my mind too.
Yeah, I agree, because I'm trying to think that you can't go all the way back. We don't have to, we can go all the way back to the French Revolution, right? So whenever you have mass unhappiness and people don't agree with a singular idea or direction going forward, you're going to have this kind of mass protest where you have a gathering of a whole bunch of groups with different ideas on how to go forward. The only thing they have in common is they hate the current occupying power, right? That's what unites them together, which is both the advantage and disadvantage, because the advantage is that they're together, so they're a political force. The disadvantage is that they can never agree how they can go forward, because all their solutions are really, really different. The only thing I didn't hear, Thomas, when you're going through it, right, is I think it's also beneficial to examine the results of Occupy Wall Street. Now that we have hindsight, right, was 10 years, and the results even more, a little more stark on all the Arab Spring countries. I mean, I'm just trying to remember. I might forget a few, right? It was Libya, Syria, Tanzania, Yemen, Egypt, right? 4 of those countries are pretty much dead. Like the Arab Spring just, I would say that if you tell all those people, if you can do it over, would you ever do this? I think 99% will say we'll never do this, because everybody's life have gotten so much worse since it's not even comparable. Their standard life have been reduced by like 90%, since the Arab Spring. Egypt is probably the best one that came out of it, right? It's probably a reduction of like 30%. So we're actually kind of lucky that the movement, both the Tea Party and the Occupy Wall Street, never turned into that type of sectarian violence, right? That completely broke the government. So I just bring that up because I'm thinking, one is the cost of the movement. The other thing is that really, let's just take a look at, was the long-term benefit? Because sometimes if you break stuff and it brings long-term benefits for a short-term pain, that's helpful. I'm just not sure that if I take the Arab Spring as example, I don't see the long-term gain. I only see that the old structure wasn't good, but now there's no structure. We just have anarchy. So.
Okay, thanks, Chris. We'll go to Sam and Marty next. I'll just follow up on Chris's point, is that when you have an uprising, whether if it leads to a full-scale revolution or just some kind of institutional change, be careful what you wish for. And that's what the French Revolution taught us, at least looking at it from history, because when you have these massive revolts, out of pure frustration, which is understandable, again, economic hardship, but then you let that get out of control into the most kind of extreme way of civilization, then you end up with Napoleon. And Napoleon, ruled for, his legacy still lives on. So yes, the French Republic also, gained from the revolution, but sometimes when these movements just kind of take off aimlessly without focus, without proper, hindsight, sometimes you kind of have to be careful what you wish for. I think some elements of that existed in Arab Spring too. I think a lot of scholars will say you cannot look at the Arab Spring as a kind of a, one broad brush, because in places like Tunisia, a fundamental change did happen. In fact, they did a major, institutional reform in the country where I think people are better off. But then in other places, someone had mentioned Syria, be careful what you wish for, because once you topple the devil that you're going to end up with the devil that you don't know, proverbially speaking. That could really have huge blowback. Okay, let's go to Sam and then Marty.
Thanks, Brian. I guess I missed the first few minutes of the meeting, so maybe, but it seems that Occupy Wall Street is kind of being conflated with the Arab Spring or the French Revolution. I mean, the fundamental difference. The Arab Spring was, at this point, you could sort of mostly qualify it as color revolutions. They were sort of like a lot of foreign interference with, especially particularly maybe like a situation in Syria or Libya. There were sort of like foreign designs for regime change, which kind of rode a genuine popular sort of element of discontent. Syria, for example, was doing quite well economically in the time before the sort of 2011, and of course Libya was doing. I mean, it's a very stable country, dictatorship nonetheless, but the standard of living of Libyans was probably, the best in Africa. Clearly, actually, the best in Africa. Occupy Wall Street was a genuine movement, and you can't really also compare because it was never gonna sort of have the same kind of impact as for the French Revolution or those other sort of events in the Arab world. And I guess I don't view Napoleon as being sort of the worst aspect of the French Revolution. The worst aspect of it was the Grand Terror that happened. This is where, if you want to look at the etymology or the origin of the word genocide, it was sort of you had probably the worst massacres, the worst genocides in France since the Roman occupation, where Julius Caesar kind of culled a good chunk of the local population, and that chapter is not very well covered in the classic history. I guess the Occupy Wall Street movement was a very genuine movement, and it was kind of like a very much an anti-establishment movement that really didn't go too far because it didn't have any sort of support in terms of genuine sort of media, or sort of like the forces that it went against were so large that it was kind of its impact was quite limited, and it would be sort of worth revisiting that sort of movement. And in a sense, it's kind of sad because today we're confronted with the even greater economic hardships, economic dislocations in the American financial system, but there is very little in terms of activism that compares to what went on during that time.
Okay, thanks for those comments, Sam. I think maybe in case you missed the intro, we were not looking at Occupy and Arab Spring as it's like, they're analogous. The main point is that something happened on the ground, whether if it's certain adversities or hardships, and you couple that with the role of social media. You have the younger generation of folks. Again, in the Arab Spring movement, you had a lot of young people, probably in the age, and average age is probably in their late 20s. Likewise, with Occupy, you've had people in their 20s who just graduated college at the height of the financial crisis. So they had a whole new different outlook on the world and what capitalism means. So something propelled them to rise up and revolt. So we're just kind of looking at what role of social media and other world events played into these, this phenomena that we saw both in the Middle East, North Africa, and then the US. So, all right, let's go to Marty and then Chris.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, so if I understood you correctly, Thomas, in the beginning, when you were talking about the Arab Spring and Tunisia, and it sounded as if you were saying that the incident that triggered the event was a result of lack of economic opportunity rather than government oppression. If that's what you said, I guess I disagree, because my understanding of the scenario was simply that a vegetable vendor had just started his business, and as is customary in that country and many like it, you have to pay some bribe to a government official to get your business started. So he had paid his bribe, and then he got hit up again from somebody else for another bribe. And it was at that point that he went ballistic and went and emulated, what's that word? Immolated himself. So to me, that's government oppression, because it was like government officials doing that, and it was very oppressive, and he was just fed up with it. And I think he's a hero in my eyes, as is everybody who participated in the Arab Spring. And I was sorry to see that it was such a dismal failure just about everywhere except Tunisia, where there was some benefit. But yeah, to me, that's government oppression. I also just wanted to bounce off of Sam, and that he, if I got you right, you said that Libya had the best economy in all of Africa. And I just wonder if it was better than South Africa. I'd be surprised if it was, but maybe it is. I don't know.
By a wide margin, sort of the
Okay,
average.
okay.
Yeah.
All right, that's good. All right, so you confirmed it. That's fine. That's what I want to know. And also to Sam, the genocide that you mentioned in the French Revolution, I'm guessing you just meant mass slaughter of a lot of people, because there was no genocide as we really define the term. It wasn't like let's kill all the Jews, or let's kill all the Protestants, or let's kill all the Catholics. Maybe it was let's kill the princes or the ruling class and the intellectuals maybe, but that's hardly a genocide, right?
There was a genocide, Marty. I could refer you to some serious French history books. They sort of basically went into whole regions like the Vendée and killed everybody, young, old, civilians. Those were known as les colonnes infernales, the infernal columns, and they sort of also devised method like sort of rudimentary gas chambers, sort of like a chemical ways, like most efficient ways to kill the most people with the least amount of resources. They killed over 300,000 people in one small region in the Vendée, and so there was this was sort of clearly a case of genocide, and it's not. As someone who grew up in France, I admit, like, I don't blame you, because that's something I didn't learn in high school. Sort of like it's something that I came across later. From the work, based on the work of serious academics in France.
So they killed all the 300,000 people in one area. What was this one area known for that society deemed it was necessary to kill these 300,000 people?
This area sort of basically, like, actually, the crux of the revolution was a Parisian and maybe like sort of other handful of other cities. The rest of the country was quite conservative and did not want, was fairly supportive of the king, and so there were a lot of regions that didn't want the revolution, support for the revolution. It was kind of similar to what went on in maybe Bolshevik Russia in 1920. So sort of entire regions were culled, like for example in the Ukraine under Stalin. It was quite similar, and you could definitely describe what went on in the Ukraine as a genocide, and it was quite similar in France, although it was more direct. They didn't just let the people starve. They went in and killed everybody, emptied entire towns, villages. People find refuge in forests. They were still kind of found and killed. If you want, I could recommend a few. I'm not sure if they're translated in English, but
no, I'm not going to read any books on it. But if you could give me a link on it, that would verify what you're saying. I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, before we move on to Chris, just in response to Marty's point, you're correct. Government oppression certainly played a role in various places across the Middle East during the Arab Spring, and Tunisia is certainly no exception. But I think it's government oppression coupled with severe economic hardship, because there's government oppression in Saudi Arabia. In fact, massive systemic government oppression. And there was Arab Spring there too.
And it was put down right away, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, because they acquiesced and they just,
Right.
gave into, made some major concessions. So it's a kind of complex, confluence of factors we need to look at. I think that's my main point. But certainly government oppression does play a central role there. All right, let's go to Chris, and then we'll go back into the timeline of Occupy. Go ahead, Chris.
Okay, so yeah, some good points being made from father-in-law, but I agree with you, Thomas. I think the key point here is that back to based on what we have read today, right? Unless there's some major revelations, most of these movements are grassroots movements. They're more like because there's always like the Russians behind the Arab Springs or George Soros funding or orchestrating the entire like Occupy Wall Street. I think if you trace back to the genesis of all these movements, there were genuine gripe and concerns from ground level citizens, that was being expressed. Once they big enough, how other influence get into that, that's a different discussion. But how they originated, I think, is pretty grassroots. And then it comes down to what you said, Thomas, is basically the after effect. It kind of becomes unpredictable, uncontrollable, right? Once the thing grows. The point you make on Tanzania is interesting because Tanzania was a tremendous hope, but then now it's a tremendous disappointment because what they have done is that they just keep pushing the problem, down the road. So in the 10 years since they had elected a democratic representative government over a dictator, they had 10 different Congresses, right? Every year they have a new Congress. Almost every year and a half, they have a new prime minister and president. And what ended up happening is that they never solve any issues. And what is happening now, I think they are going back into a dictatorial system, which is amazing. Literally, they basically says, we tried democracy for 10 years. now we want to go, now we're voting as a population to go back to like strongman dictatorship. I just brought that up because it's a very sobering example, to the limit, of the power and benefit of democracy, right? When you test in the real world. And the other thing, just the after effect of all these protests, it seems that this is, now I'm not going to claim this is moral or amoral. I would just say that it seems that from an effectiveness point of view, it seems that the government that responds most brutally and the fastest to these protests, especially if they're authoritarian government, tend to survive out better. Where if they let it actually have some air, they actually end up to be much, much worse, right? So you compare like the reaction of Belarus, right, versus what happened in like say Libya and also what happened in Egypt, right? Were much more iron-fisted versus what Assad initially did in Syria and what Gaddafi did in Libya. It just seems that the more you let the movement grow, the population doesn't just air its grievance. You also start losing control as the government. So that's just an interesting side effect. So yeah, I'll stop.
All right, thanks, Chris. And one of the nice things about this being a New York City-based organization is that we could contextualize this both in terms of other international examples as well as historical examples. So, I mean, that's really interesting that a lot of you have different insights into how you could look at this particular phenomena and then juxtapose it with other international events. Let's see, Tara has her hand up. Go ahead, Tara.
Hi, good evening. I had just wanted to say to Chris's point, I think these movements work best. Yes, they generally these movements do start out grassroots, and they a lot of times end up becoming something sort of like a wildfire, right? It starts as a little campfire and then you get some brush nearby on fire and then it just kind of grows until it becomes something that you're unable to control. I think that's also because a lot of these movements don't have one single leader, like they're grassroots and they're leaderless on purpose, especially because we know this country, unfortunately, our government is famous for surveilling leaders of grassroots movements and things of that nature, civil rights movements, etc. So I think that's also why, we don't see these movements have the impact, the positive impact, and the change, the changes that we want to see don't really materialize like we saw after some of the union movements or the civil rights movements and things of that nature, the women's the women's rights movements, etc. So I think if there's leadership, that it would probably be more successful. However, we know with this country, we know how sometimes the government in this country, both local, state, and federal, move when it comes to things like that.
Yeah, thanks for those comments, Tara. And that's one of the criticisms leveled at Occupy, is that it was a leaderless movement. It was more like a horizontal movement in terms of its organizational structure. And it was, full of idealistic notions of what the world ought to be. But you do need some kind of vision, someone to kind of push the agenda or the prerogative, but certainly that did not happen. And we'll get into this later on, but I think what started out as these protests due to severe economic anxieties then kind of morphed into what we would consider today like a social justice type of a flavor. Again, whether if that's good or not, that depends on how you view these issues. But one kind of camp is that, well, let's just focus on the economics, because the idea is that if you empower everyone economically, then the rising tide will lift all boats. But on the other hand, if you want to take a more kind of all-inclusive approach, dealing with economic anxieties, social justice, and everything else that you think is the right thing to do, then I think you might lose the focus. And I think you kind of saw that towards the end of Occupy's tenure at Zuccotti Park. Let's see, Lisa has her hand up.
Sorry, I had to figure out how to unmute myself. First time here, not sure how this all flows. Occupy Wall Street, when it first happened, it was just like, for me, it was just like too much of this, too much of that. I wasn't really into the, the actual topic or how people were feeling. I've matured a lot in my investigations of everything, but just going back to the basic thing, and I do believe in social media. I think there was suddenly a place where people could say, wow, this is really different. Those people really are different than I am. And trying to resolve that, that inequity in some way and in some words. And although I don't agree necessarily with that whole kind of Occupy thing, I understand, and understood then that they're like, suddenly getting it. And that was a way, that was that release, that was an, international phenomenon where they could say, you know what, stuff's not fair. It's just not fair. And I'm in a position where it doesn't seem to matter what I do, that inequity still exists. And so going from there, as we go through everything, it's still the same thing. We still have the same issues, and social media certainly led us to believe that. I mean, I get smarter every day about all of those differences and what to do about them, and how people relate to them and how they really do count. And so I'm just trying to kind of bring it back to that Occupy Wall Street thing, and how it has, even though it may not have been successful, it's certainly the points they were making and the problems they had were real and true. And maybe they didn't have all the means of making those things happen. The current political environment is still like, using all of that angst and all that anger and trying to make, policies that can somehow, make some of those disparities better. So that's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa, for those comments. And that's an interesting observation. as to framing these political movements as was it a success or a failure. Seems like a lot of the media tries to portray this in like a binary fashion. Was it a success? Was it a failure? I think in some instances you could characterize it in that way, but I think a lot of times these are very complex outcomes with a lot of nuances. Again, how do you measure success? And we'll go into this later. You know, is success measured by the increase of the standard of living? Is it measured by, you know, electoral victories? Is it measured by legislation? Or is it, you know, measured by things like the public discourse? The fact that, again, whether if you appreciate this or not, but the term socialism has become kind of hip these days for some people. So is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Well, one thing's for sure, it really changed the dialogue, because I think before Occupy, again, if we were to go back, you know, 15, 20 years, just looking at it observationally, seems like the left in the US was kind of aimless, I think, because again, you know, you had, you know, two administration of George W. Bush, and it just seems like they were not coalescing around a single cause. You had kind of the, you know, anti-war kind of left. You had, you know, some left who, you know, were more progressive on like, you know, cultural issues. But this idea of a populist uprising just wasn't really, you know, seen. And it seems like after, you know, I guess 3 decades, if you go back to Reagan and just kind of this idea of neoliberal market-based capitalism, seems like that was kind of the direction that the US was heading into. Again, whether if you agree with that or not, that certainly depends on your ideological viewpoint. But something sparked during this period where now I think the left has gained some momentum and traction. But we'll get into the legacy later, because some of you might say that it has, you know, veered off from its central focus. And now it's focused on other issues. Okay, let's go with some other members here. Kyrie and then Sarah.
Right, cool. Hello. Yeah, I appreciate that whole last bit you gave there, Thomas. I wasn't in New York at the time that it happened. I was actually in Philly. And so and I do mean we, because I was actually a part of it. So I was down there and we occupied City Hall. Mind you, I was only down there for 2 days because I couldn't take it. But it was a very interesting time in how people, as you pointed out, want to describe it as a success or a failure. From being down there, and I wasn't at the time, you know, far left or anything, or I was definitely liberal, and really not a part of the political scene, but I was kind of struggling in Philly, specifically in 2011. I was on welfare, food stamps, all that good shit. And people were like, it was a very real resentment. It was a very real, especially in Philly, because at the time, because it was around the recession, and they had the lowest rate of job growth, like one of the lowest in the US at that time, coming out of the recession. It sucked, especially when you had all those college kids and everyone's graduating, coming to the city trying to find a job. So when people were down there, it was a coalescing resentment of the unfairness when you bring up, you know, the 1% having all this wealth over the other 99%, just owning it. And it really did bring in questions that kind of were not asked before. And I think that's really the reason why. And these questions kind of would go across, no matter if you're middle class, if you're upper middle class. There were people who interacted, who would come down and you know, came down and held programs, or people speaking from like literal soapboxes down City Hall. It was a very, you could feel the energy. And of course it died because like you've mentioned, there was no coalescing idea at the time. It was a lot of social angst, a lot of social problems with race and economic disparities all thrown in one. I think what that's done today, it's taken those hardcore few, the ones who stayed down there the entire time. I mean, like a month before Philadelphia kicked them out, and kicked out because a lot of the homeless people were getting raped down there. for real. People were doing drugs, needles all over City Hall, by the time it was over. The hardcore few, I think, they turned inward and kind of became what is today. Whether you could say socialists or democratic socialists or whatever, just Marxist, just leaning, progressive. It's become, those elements have become what I think is progressive movement today, and what we're seeing happening today. And you did mention earlier that it always seems like it died out because they couldn't come together on these issues. That's kind of been happening to the left for over the past 3 decades. There's like a chart that shows like the core beliefs of those who lean left. And at the base, it just widens over the years, whereas like the more right-leaning side has remained a little bit more consistent. But yeah, those are my 2 cents.
Okay, thanks for those comments. Later on, when we look at the similarities and differences of Occupy and the Tea Party, I think we're going to see that the trend, both of them shifting into their respective corners. So if you ask a lot of the progressives, they'll say that the right has shifted way far to the right plank rather, and then the left has done just the opposite. So again, that's just more of an observation. If you disagree, then certainly that's something we're going to go into further. Kyrie mentioned an interesting point about the popularity of the democratic socialists and the Marxists. For those of you who went down to Zuccotti Park, or maybe you've seen these video footages, it does have this kind of like a Marxist feel, in the sense that they had these general assemblies, multiple times a day, where they do these mic check and people just kind of like chant, back and forth. I think the organization or the people down there did that in the spirit of being inclusive, but it certainly felt like people were promoting this idea that everyone there is equal. Everyone has an equal voice. Doesn't matter if you're young, old, everything in between. You have a voice. You have the microphone. And I think when you start to kind of afford that opportunity to everyone, then I think you might kind of dilute your vision. And just one last point, because I do recall visiting Occupy down there as an observer. And one time they were having a general assembly, and they were debating on whether if they should compost or recycle. And they debated for like hours and hours and hours just on that issue. And look, if you are in favor of free speech, having an open dialogue, that's great. But if your organizational motto is, we're 99%, we want to bring certain sense of equity back into our system, I'm just not sure if having those kinds of public debates hours on end is productive or the best use of your time. Okay, let's go with Tara and then Lorraine. Tara's on.
Hi. Yeah, so I wanted to mention, because I had made the correlation. Well, I had mentioned earlier about how maybe Occupy didn't have the impact that people had wanted because there wasn't leadership structure or something of that sort. But you guys keep mentioning also that you think it dissolved at the end, or deteriorated, if you will, into like a fight about social issues and things of that nature. I want us to all remember, you can change economic policies as far as, for example, you could say, okay, if you come into the job at this rate, everybody's going to get paid the same. We're not going to charge more taxes to this person, to that person, et cetera. But keep in mind that there are still certain policies in place socially that impact you economically. There are policies in place socially that impact, for example, where you can live, which impacts you economically. It impacts your children. It impacts your ability to build wealth, which is an economic issue, but it comes from a social issue. So I think trying to separate the two has been the problem all along. There's a reason, for example, Martin Luther King fought for equal rights as well as equal economic rights, because they are linked intrinsically. There is no difference. That's all.
Yeah, thanks, Tara. So what I've noticed about Occupy during the later phase of it, during its occupancy at Zuccotti Park, is that it seemed like the message kind of morphed into racial justice. Again, keep in mind, New York City, 2011, one of the most controversial, unpopular program was stop and frisk by the NYPD. We had Mayor Bloomberg, who wholeheartedly endorsed it because he thought that was one of the best preventative measure for crime reduction. And if you look at the chants and what people were airing their grievances about, this would be like, in the late October to early November of 2011, there was a lot of grievance against police brutality. And to Tara's point, I think those protesters probably viewed economic issues are intertwined with other social justice issues. And as we'll get into the legacy part later, you could even make an argument that the early kind of the preview of BLM was probably conceived during these demonstrations. Now, keep in mind, 2011 was before all these, high-profile police shootings like the Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman matter that came after Occupy. But you could certainly see a lot of tensions building out. And for those of you in New York City, we've had, just decades of high-profile killings by the NYPD against, African-American men. So whether it's, Amadou Diallo, Sean Bell, just the list goes on. Akai Gurley. All right. Let's see.
But also remember that stop and frisk didn't just, yes, it obviously disproportionately impacted Black people, but specifically Black men, but also it just disproportionately impacted poor people. And that's why I say that social issues and economic issues are intrinsically linked, because the people who were the neighborhoods that they were patrolling for these things, for stop and frisk, were poor neighborhoods. They were neighborhoods with the zip codes with the lowest average income, average salary in the city. We're talking places where people are, as Kyrie had mentioned earlier, these are places where people are on welfare, food stamps, WIC, they're like Section 8. Those are the same places. So they're not just Black people, but they're also poor people. That's why the two are linked.
Good point. And not to get too much off the subject, but the Bloomberg administration would say, look, we're just targeting high crime neighborhoods. Well, high crime neighborhoods tend to correlate with the level of economic prosperity or lack thereof. So again, was that a pretextual reason for then targeting African Americans? Well, the High Court in New York State said yes, and they overruled certain provisions of the mayor's approach to stop and frisk. All right, let's go with Lorraine and then Chris.
Yeah, first of all, I want to just touch on something that Tara said. I think that since probably the 1930s, there's always been resentment against what's perceived as inequality, economic inequality. And there's always been, whenever there's pushback, there's always been this specter of socialism. That has persisted to this day. What's interesting is that some of the people who could only benefit from some of the social programs that the Democrats oppose it just because of being tribal and somehow, I don't know if brainwashed is the right word, but they basically are voting against their own economic interests. I just find that the irony there. But what I was going to also say was that I don't recall, unless I just don't recall, I don't recall there being a whole lot of street demonstrations up until this point. I know that there were a lot of demonstrations all through the 60s, the 70s, 80s, but once the internet started, there were a lot more online kind of things going on as opposed to actually feet out on the streets. Maybe I missed it, but I just felt like that was kind of a resurgence of something that I hadn't seen in a while. And as a result, I was struck by how tolerant for as long as it lasted, that the police didn't crack down on it. I mean, and that is a contrast with what you see in other countries where they see that as an existential threat, and they absolutely brutally put down any kinds of protests, demonstrations and such. So I thought that New York really handled it with quite a lot of restraint and patience. And I was surprised because I didn't know how that was going to turn out. I couldn't foresee what the reaction was going to be to this. But I could see, and I've witnessed in other countries what happens when people protest. It does not go anywhere near like it does in this country. That's all I wanted to say.
So it turns out that in the city of New York, if you want to gather with 20 or more people in the city, in the public, you need a permit. So I think that's one of the reasons why the city has been somewhat successful in the past as a preventative measure for these kind of mass gatherings. I mean, for those of you in New York City, I'm just going to toss some, geographical references. When you go to Washington Square Park, that's always a popular place for gatherings and protests. The Union Square Park is also another popular place. Of course, the City Hall is certainly symbolic. But I think what we saw with Occupy is that this mayor was very strategic. He knew that he could unleash, the powers of NYPD, but he had to do it cautiously because during the early phases of Occupy, it seems like the mainstream media was not really paying attention to what was going on. It was just, okay, people are protesting. What's the big deal? But I think once these high-profile incidents got captured on video, and again, with social media, these things go viral. I think the Bloomberg administration was very cautious not to use too much force to kind of quash these uprisings or protests. And then what happened was October 1st was certainly kind of a big, memorable moment for Occupy, because I believe that's when they crossed from Manhattan to Brooklyn, crossing the Brooklyn Bridge. And by some estimation, tens of thousands of protesters just showed up. And I believe that was where massive arrests took place, probably to the tune of several hundred. And I think what really, garnered the sympathy of the public was that these weren't just, your ragtag, young protesters, out to no good, just, trying to stir some commotion. I think a lot of these were, people from labor, the clergy, they were present because they felt compelled to join the movement. So when they saw these video footages of kind of the non-conventional protesters now being arrested by the NYPD, I think that's where you start to see the public sympathy towards the movement really shift from a bunch of, rambunctious, protesters into, oh, wow, this must be some kind of a, populist movement that kind of the mainstream or, like an average, person could relate to. So that's kind of what happened by mid-October. There's a lot more to what happened towards the end of Zuccotti Park, but those were some of the, changes that were observed at the time. All right, let's go to Chris.
I'll just follow up on that point since we're discussing that. This is something made famous, right? All the way going back to Gandhi and Martin Luther King. They actually always told their supporters during the rally, when they're being engaged forcefully by the military and the police, don't run away, right? Be brave and be ready to take some, physical punishment, because the resulting images, right, and sounds will be such a powerful weapon against governments that place such a high value on saving face, right? So with the advent of internet and the mobile phones, it really put the governments that want to keep this facade that they never oppress anybody, right? In a very difficult position, because they do any kind of engagement on a physical engagement, they are potentially be put in very bad light, right? And so if you're organizing any movement, whether it's the right or the left, you will take full advantage of this. I mean, I was, talking to someone in the police to say that, if you had before the mobile phone, I mean, you had like a neo-Nazi, alt-right movement, like march, right? Or a KKK march in the street calling for people to be hanged, the police can engage them forcefully. Now they're not so, willing, not because they're supporting the movement, but because if they beat up one of these people, right, it shows on TV, the effect, will be the same if they beat up, some Black Lives Matter people and etc. There'll be some people who loves it, but there'll be a huge chunk of people against it, right? Especially the moderates who just abhors violence. So I really do think that put the government in a pretty tricky spot, and is the reason why we're having more and more these type of street protest, because unlike a authoritarian government, you don't really have you can't really hand out the stick so freely. And the other thing, this is, I think, from a discussion maybe 10 minutes before, when we're talking about the discussions, right? So I don't know, with these movements, it's a really legitimate discussion. It's more like I'm just talking past each other, right? I'm going to make my point. I'm pretty dogmatic on this point, and I'm just talking past you. So, for example, if I had to give Occupy Wall Street, any credit in terms of the results they've achieved, the thing I can think of off the top of my head is minimum wage, right? So they brought a much higher focus on minimum wage, which is a good thing, because their minimum wage on a federal level is still $7.25, which is illogical. Now, where it gets dogmatic, right, is, there's actually pretty strong bipartisan support to bring that to 12, right, or 12 and a half. I don't know exactly. That actually, I think, if I remember correctly, have about a 50% support from the Republicans, right, in the Senate. But it's basically, it comes down to a point where it's 15 or nothing, right? Same thing with tuition forgiveness. Yeah, it's like, is it okay if I just forgive 40%? No, it's 100% or nothing. So the other thing I think is really smart and make people like Gandhi and MLK more effective is they said, Rome was not built in a day. I think they always operate on that scenario. It's like, I have an end goal in mind. It might take longer than my lifetime, but anytime I can make small progress, even if it's incremental, I will make it, right? And then hopefully my successor will just keep rolling the ball up, up, and then we'll eventually get there, right? Versus saying, no, I want to achieve this today. So if you don't give me what I want, even if you offer me some kind of compromise, I reject that, which I find it just to be unproductive, right? And it's not like you don't get what you want, now it's basically, I don't know how is this logical where if you can't get 100% what you want, you don't even want 50%. And this is part of the this is kind of part of the debate with almost everything. And just the last thing I will say is that this Occupy Wall Street definitely had, in coupling with technology, definitely had a pretty strong negative influence on our relation with our foreign allies and potential enemies, right? So China, for example, reacted very, very negatively from Occupy Wall Street, because actually before 2010, if you look at between Bush and Obama, they had a very, very amicable relationship with China, right? Both on trades and policy and everything else. The reason they're really afraid of Occupy Wall Street is, one, they had a similar experience 1992 with Tiananmen Square. And two is Hong Kong, right after Occupy Wall Street, did it occupy Hong Kong, right? Almost like word for word and strategy for strategy, that really put the Chinese government in a bind. France, already, and Germany both have said, we don't want this kind of a woke movement and protest coming into our country, right? Because they've seen that as a American export that they don't want. So I think we have to be careful, you know, like in terms of how, as political parties, how we foster and guide these kind of movement along, because it does have a side effect that's pretty significant, right? Because it really, I would say that it's not the whole thing. It may not even be like, you know, the most important thing, but definitely it's a pretty important factor as China is considering, like, do I want to shift fully into this more of a Western representative type of government, right? You know, and decouple myself from this, you know, like top-down government. And they look at Occupy Wall Street, like, basically they just says, we don't have a mechanism that can handle this, you know, if this ever comes to China, because we don't want to go on and like just, you know, and send the army in again, right? So I'll just say that that's a side effect that unfortunately that happened with Occupy Wall Street, also internationally.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Before we move on to Tara and Diamond, I think the irony behind comparing Occupy to how this could get exported into other countries such as China and threaten their system. If you look at the purists in Occupy, they would love to have a system that's kind of like communist China, where everything is equal, egalitarian, and Marxist. So I think that's kind of the irony behind it, because they, you know, if you talk to like your, strong vocal proponent of an Occupy protester, they would talk about the virtues of Fidel Castro's universal healthcare system, how, you know, people get free education, high rate of literacy. So sometimes be careful what you wish for. But
Tom, can I just respond quickly? So I think that's always a misconception of modern China. China right now is neither equal. It's not equal. It's definitely not equal. It's probably turning into one of the more unequal countries in the world, because it economically it adapted a fully capitalist system, and it's now communist. You know, even though it has a communist party. So both Russia and China has this moniker, right? Well, people think it was 30 years ago, but today both countries are pretty private, capitalistic. The difference is that the government is not representative, you know, by the populace. It's a single party system, more or less, right? But no, I think the people who are truly communist and Marxist in both countries wants the current government out, on both in Russia and China, because they believe they have betrayed the ideology completely, right, by going into this capitalist system. All right.
right, I wasn't referring to the current mercantilism system of China. I was referring to more kind of the, you know, the old cultural revolution period, where again everything is egalitarian, and you know those, you know, very ardent protesters on Occupy might embrace that in the name of equality, inclusion, egalitarianism, high rate of literacy, etc. Let's go to Diamond and then Sam.
Hello. So first thing I want to point out that with Occupy Wall Street, to be honest, I was like 16, 17 when that came. So, and I was living around DC at the time. I do remember more conversations about, in terms of where I was at, what would that mean for my future? And I do think that even though the conversations at that time may not have been productive, the conversations that followed that, the seeds that Occupy has planted, and the people who, and the young people who were participating and those who came afterwards, is really where the fruit is going to be born from. Because it got us thinking, how are we interacting with our economy? How, is our economy serving us as a whole? And if not, how can we fix it as a society? In terms of stances that politicians are taking, I think you also have to weigh the cost benefit, because sometimes even compromises can be detrimental. Sometimes even taking a compromise can slow down you getting 100%. For instance, with the student loan debate, if we happen to only take a 40% forgiveness program, then that'll probably be it for the next 20, 30 years. And finally, his point about how that comes off to the international community as a whole. and how these ideas can be exported. First, I do believe America always looks crazy, to be fair. A lot of our movements, especially when you take media snapshots of it, could look crazy to the world. But then also it kind of points out to the fact that this is what democracy looks like. This is what American democracy at the very least looks like. And in terms of China, I think they already kind of got the message that take what they want and move on, and they leave the rest behind. That's all.
Okay, thanks for those comments. Yeah, Diamond is absolutely right. I mean, democracy is a messy process. And I think the framers of the Constitution certainly saw that. They try to build in a lot of checks and balances to make sure that it doesn't go off the rail. A couple other points that Diamond had mentioned, as well as Chris. And we've talked about these concepts before. One is this kind of ideological purity test. You know, when do you have to take a hard stance, demand 100% with no compromise? When can you compromise? And you know, these things are very complicated. And you know, I think the past trends have shown that when you impose these kind of litmus tests on these issues, it's not as productive. And you might win these symbolic battles, but you're going to lose the war. The other point that Chris had mentioned, I forgot to mention it before, is this notion of incrementalism versus like a wholesale change, right? And I think Chris was alluding to the fact that, look, sometimes changes take forever, like what he said about Rome was not built in one day. True. I think some folks, especially when we look at history, will say the change should have come yesterday. You know, justice delayed is justice denied. So I think throughout the US history as well as world history, there are times when certain groups are confronted with challenges where if you just wait for incrementalism, the slow moving train to show up, well, you're not going to see the change. So I think that's one of the themes, one of the recurring themes that we see in the system that we have today. All right, let's go to Sam and then Tara. And then after that, I want to kind of conclude with what happened at Zuccotti Park. So we're running, let's see, about halfway into the program. So let's go with Sam and then Tara.
Thanks, Thomas. I think who was it? Someone, Chris. I think Chris talked about China and mentioned the sort of inequalities. To kind of bring it back, to the subject, the main issue is the driving issue. Really, is the decline in purchasing power, economic opportunities in the United States, and that decline is most acute in generational terms. Sort of the millennials that came out in 2008 and the Zoomers have, for example, like a very limited access to housing in terms of home ownership, and increasingly limited access to sort of high-paying jobs. I guess like 2 years ago, I hired someone out of college, and his salary was for some like a job that was similar to my first job out of college, and his salary was about the same that I was making, when I graduated, which was a long time ago, back in the 1990s. That is the main driving force in terms of China. Sort of the purchasing power of the average worker in China since around that era, the mid 2000s, has gone up by a factor of 8, maybe 9, in some places 10. I mean, that's why some factories are actually starting to close, and China is starting to outsource. Their standard of living has skyrocketed. So you can't really compare. There's not going to be anything like that in China, because this movement is basically driven by a decline in purchasing power. And you're seeing the same thing in France and other countries. The Gilets jaunes movement is a very strong movement, and fundamentally based on the sort of certain sort of working class, middle class, and retirees kind of being having their standard of living degrade to a level where like you have a high percentage of the population that is struggling, and that is the main driver here. Yeah, and in terms of the inequalities in China, their middle class is really thriving like no other middle class in the history of civilization. Never in the history of civilization. You basically have close to 800 million people who are sort of living middle class lifestyle that were living in abject poverty 30, 40 years ago. So you're not going to see anything like that in China, really. And yeah, that's the main aspect here. The fact that the decline in purchasing power is very much has a generational angle, and that was sort of the driver in New York back in the 2000s during that event.
Okay, thanks, Sam. And let's go to Tara.
Is it my turn? Sorry.
Yes.
Okay. Hi. I had just wanted to say, oh gosh, it was something that Chris had said and Sam had just reiterated. Oh geez. I was afraid this was gonna happen. I do apologize. Never mind.
All right, well, if you think of it, we'll come back. But I guess we'll just kind of wrap it up with what happened in occupied New York City, because,
Sorry, I
towards,
just remembered.
okay, go ahead, Tara.
Okay, so the other thing too, Chris was saying, and Sam, that's what Sam had reiterated, was taking sort of, if they offer you 40 and you can't get the full 100, take the 40, because later on you can try to get closer to the 100. The thing about that is, if anybody remembers the fight over the ACA, you'll remember a lot of the markups and things like that. What happened? Democrats said, okay, we'll capitulate, we'll let you amend things, add things, take some things out right in the margins, this, that, and the third. And anybody tell me what happened? How did it pass? Barely. So at the end of the day, no, I'm not ready for them to start because the negotiations are not done in good faith. So negotiations not done in good faith are not worth it, in my opinion. And I am happy that that's the stance that some of the progressives, and I hope some of the others, have in Congress. Because if you're not going to negotiate in good faith, it's a waste of time. If you're going to negotiate me down, water down what I've offered you, and then not vote for it anyway after I've added the things that you've asked to add, what is the point in me asking you for permission? I might as well just find a way to go over, through, around, or above you.
Yeah, and I mean, speaking of ACA, I mean, that was your classic Obama way of governing, which is, he would always say, well, and he would use bread as an analogy. Do I want a full loaf or half a loaf? And he would always say, well, taking a half a loaf is not a bad thing, because at least you get something rather than nothing. And that's the rationale that was used, whether if it's the Obamacare or even things like the troop enhancement in Afghanistan. The generals wanted 70,000 troops, and Obama said, well, I'll give you half a loaf, 30,000. So that seems to be kind of his governing philosophy. But let's bring this back to Occupy New York City, because by then this movement kind of caught on to other places, all throughout the U.S. West Coast. Kyrie mentioned Philly. I think in other nations too, you had all these kind of encampments pop up. But then something happened on November 15th. So this would have been just shy of, I guess, 2 months of Occupy being there. There was like a midnight raid where basically all the protesters were kicked out of Zuccotti Park. NYPD just kind of rushed in the dead of night. They just basically removed all the tents and everything. And that was pretty much the end of Occupy Wall Street in New York. So as we close that chapter from of November of 2011, I do want to go into the next topic. I was going to do this in a breakout room, but we have a smaller group now. So why don't we just kind of discuss amongst ourselves, like a free-flowing discussion, which is we've talked plenty about the Occupy Wall Street, but there are comparisons made to the Tea Party, who just, came into existence maybe 2 years ago. So do you think there are some overlaps to Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street? Kyrie?
Sorry about that. Yes. I do kind of see some overlap. Specifically, I'm sorry, I'm on my phone. I was switching back and forth to your actual meetup wording. It said ideologically and organizationally. I would say ideologically as a counterpart, yes. Organizationally, not by a long shot. They haven't, and I think that was a failing Grace, whether by design or by accident. It was just the kind of the disorganization of it all that kind of made it kind of fall apart. Whereas the Tea Party have there is that same very real, now kind of in my later years leaning to the right, there is still that same real resentment still. So it's the same thing about the oppressiveness of the government, the unfairness of the system. However, it is a little bit more coalesced. And it's not as kind of tear down the system or rah rah, or or at least it's not that messaging on the surface. It is a little bit more palatable to the mainstream, but it does still, I think, has that kind of same spirit. That's all.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Kyrie. I think some of the ideological similarities is that, for the first time, I think, to my memory, both movements, they were criticizing openly this notion of crony capitalism. Again, I think before these movements came into existence, no one really talked about crony capitalism. So that's, one interesting thing. No one really talked about corporate welfare. That's a real thing in the US. And I think before these two movements came into existence, that was not part of the public dialogue. If you look at both movements too, there's this strong undercurrent of anti-establishment. Certainly the Tea Party, they're no fan of, their party leaders or the DC insiders, etc. And I think you see that also with Occupy. And because they have a very strong anti-establishment sentiment, I think that there's certainly a populist tone for both groups. And I think the last thing, which is kind of interesting, is both movements will say that they are adamantly against this idea of big government colluding with big corporations. This is where I think there are differences, because if you ask, your typical or ardent supporter of these movements, one side will say, well, who do you trust less? Do you trust the government less, or do you trust the corporations less? And I think Tea Party supporter would say, well, I distrust the government. Whereas I think the Occupy protester would say, well, yeah, government is bad, but it's the big corporation, Wall Street, big pharma, you go down the list. So I think that's where you see a little bit of a differentiation between the two movements.
Weird question. Do you think that Elizabeth Warren, because I was just looking up when she was elected, right? And she's one of those people who has been pushing more economically equitable policies and talking about those kinds of things. Do you think that her election to Congress and people like her sort of rode that wave of people's eyes being opened, or the conversation being turned, as you were saying, to things like corporate welfare, to things like stock buybacks, to things like these giant bonuses that CEOs were getting while, they were cutting, like, for example, Walmart using money to buy back stocks while they're cutting hours and benefits to employees and things of that nature. Because those are things that she talks about, that she's been talking about for years. And so I wonder if people in Congress like her, if any of you, look at it the same way, that they sort of rode that wave of the Occupy movement of talking about economic equity and taking the power back sort of from these corporations. My apologies, I didn't mean to jump in on you, but I didn't want to forget again.
No, that's a great question, because I think one of the outcomes of Occupy is you have Senator Warren, who previously, was very involved with the Obama administration. She founded the Consumer Protection Board. And I think this is, again, another interesting comparison, because I think Tara is correct in a sense that the phenomena of Senator Warren, Bernie Sanders being a presidential candidate, I think that kind of rose from these movements. Again, if you look at then Professor Warren from Harvard, her main approach was, look, they need to penalize the bad faith actors on Wall Street, and she really wanted to impose some, strict regulations and punitive measures against Wall Street for all these, kind of exotic instruments like, credit default swap, collateralized debt obligations, mortgage-backed securities. In some ways, I think, I'm not sure how much of this was intentional, but she wanted to, repeal what then President Clinton had passed, which is the Commodities Futures Modernization Act, which effectively repealed the Glass-Steagall Act. So I think she wanted to reinstitute Glass-Steagall ultimately. And if it weren't for movements like Occupy coming into prominence, I'm just not sure if we would be having this conversation. Because again, before 2008, if you were to ask an average person, hey, what's Glass-Steagall Act? No one would know what that is. And I think 2008 market crash was certainly kind of an awakening moment where people paid attention to what was happening with Wall Street, as well as government programs that really encouraged home ownership, which led to this predatory subprime lending. So hopefully that answers your question, Tara. So anything else on this comparison of Occupy Tea Party? So I guess one other point that I'll bring up that Kyrie had mentioned is, I think organizationally, they're a little bit different in a sense that if you look at it like an average age of Occupy, it tends to be younger, usually in their 20s. I think Tea Party, they tend to be a bit older, probably in their 40s, 50s and upward. And older people tend to be reliable voters. So they go and vote. Whereas I think young people, because of the demographics, sometimes they move around a lot, it's really hard for them to vote. So whether if these organizations translate it into victories at the ballot box, well, I think the outcome is pretty clear when you look at the two organizations, the two movements. Okay. So anything else on Tea Party, Occupy before we just kind of wrap it up with the legacy and the outcome of Occupy? Okay. So I guess, I would just say that whether if you support the outcome or not, it's certainly irrefutable that it really changed the dialogue in the US. And if you were to do like a LexisNexis search of articles and blogs that were posted about 10 years ago, it was things like income inequality, the wealth gap, debts, whether it's personal debt, student loans, etc. These things were not really talked about out in the open. I mean, maybe people talked about it, within their personal circles, but this was not part of the public dialogue. And it seems like some of the organizational outgrowth of Occupy is you have things like the debt collective, cancel student loans. That seems to gain some traction these days. So what do you guys think about that? Those kinds of outgrowths after Occupy? Any comments?
I think the term 1% originated from that movement as well, right?
Which one?
The 1%, sort of the notion and terminology of 1%.
Oh, sure. We are 99% was the chant, that you would commonly hear at Occupy. Yeah, so basically, seems like the dialogue shifted quickly into that, okay, the 1%, they need to pay their taxes. And again, to the best of my memory, I don't recall there being like this kind of public outcry for the millionaires and billionaires to pay their fair share of taxes. And I think Occupy really kind of solidified that grievance that people had. Let's see. Marty has his hand. Go ahead, Marty.
Thank you. Yeah, so first I want to address the debt, college debt, canceling college debt. I'm totally opposed to canceling 1 penny of it. You know, one woman that I spoke with, and of course this is just anecdotal, and she's in her early 30s. She's very successful. She's in IT. She took out a lot of student loans. She's still paying them off, but she could afford to do so. Nevertheless, she loves the idea of, you know, canceling her debt. And she says, you know, that, gee, she was just 18 years old when, you know, some guy conned her into signing on the dotted line or something. And so I asked her, well, should we raise the age of, you know, how old you need to be before you could sign, you know, for a loan? And she goes, oh, no, 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 don't take away my freedom. You know, I think, no, people need to be responsible for their debt and for their loans. I don't see, you know, why other taxpayers should have to foot the bill. I just don't understand that. And you know, another anecdote revolving around the same thing. So, it must have been about 8 years ago now. So my friend's daughter was ready to go to college, and she wanted to go to a school back on the East Coast where it was going to cost $20,000 a year. And so I said to my friend, you know, because he was going to be paying for it, I said, you know, well, did you talk to her about going to, you know, Metro, the local university here in Denver, where it would be $6,000 a year? And he said, no, I didn't talk to her about it. She wants to go to that school in Connecticut. And, you know, so she went, and then that was it. You know, but there are options. That's the point I'm trying to make. For me, I went in the military and I got the GI Bill, and I went to school on the GI Bill. You know, I lived in a roach-infested studio apartment without any air conditioning for 6 years. You know, it wasn't very pleasant, but I didn't take out any loans, and I was able to get through. So it's doable. And so I'm opposed to that. There was one other thing, but I forgot, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Marty. Canceling student debt is always a thorny one because, again, the issue is always, is it a one-time cancellation or is this going to be a recurring thing? And I think you could certainly make an argument on both sides that's compelling. One thing that's interesting about this particular generation of protesters at Occupy is that, again, a lot of them, your average, you know, protester at the time who are in their early to mid 20s, they just graduated at the height of the Great Recession. And, you know, this is, you know, one of the worst economic calamities that the nation had faced. And I think by the time when these crop of graduates came out of college, their student debt was probably, you know, 3, 4, perhaps even 5 times more than the preceding generation. For those of you in New York City, you know, there's an institution called City University of New York, CUNY, which is a pretty well-respected institution. Back in the 60s and 70s, I think it was a free institution. If you lived in New York City, there was free tuition. I think if you look at the University of California, which is kind of the crown jewel of, you know, California's higher educational system, I think they used to be very affordable, probably comparable to what you would pay at a local community college. But now the tuition has almost tripled, quadrupled. So those who are in favor of student loan cancellation would certainly make those comparisons. But again, it's a very thorny one because, you know, how do you administer it? There's all kinds of unintended consequences too. All right, let's see. We have Aya, Kyrie, Tara. Aya, are you there?
Sorry,
Okay.
sorry, I was muted. Sorry. No, I just wanted to make a quick, maybe perhaps a little like cynical comment that like, isn't it the 99% that wants the 1% to support them? You know, getting back to that student loan cancellation, it's the 1% that's going to be paying all the, you know, like they're the hefty, like corporations do pay their share of, you know, taxes, right? And then if the 99%, you know, like if they're talking about socialism, you know, money doesn't come out of nowhere, right? And you know, usually it's the rich people, the 1% that puts, you know, the bulk of the, you know, the taxes, right? And so I just feel it's kind of like there's a conflict there. Like, you know, they're looking for you know, equality, but then at the same time, like they're trying to like, you know, suck on the, you know, the corporations so that they could get their free ride. And I just feel, you know, it's kind of like you can't have it both ways. That's it. Sorry.
Okay, thanks, Aya. That's a good point. As the saying goes, you know, don't kill the hand that feeds your mouth. So I think that's Aya's point. That's a good point. However, I think the protesters from Occupy would say, look, at the time of 2008 financial crisis, the 1% did very well. In fact, the 1% got richer in some instances because there were all these incentive structures for them not to lose as much. Whereas I think a lot of the 99%ers, you know, those whose homes were foreclosed or underwater, they lost everything. They lost their life savings.
Right.
And combination of that, combination of all these, you know, exotic investment products that was pushed by Wall Street,
Right.
they lost their entire savings, whether pensions, 401k, otherwise. So I mean,
Right.
they could make that argument, as well as the effective tax rate. Again, the 99% against the 1%. I think there's a pretty big difference where, you know, the effective tax rate of 1%, because a lot of their wealth is based on capital gains. They're taxed at a lower rate as opposed to, you know, those, you know, working middle class, lower class, etc. So it's an interesting argument, but I think this is, again, before Occupy, before 2008 financial crisis, we were not having these conversations. And now I think the floodgate has just kind of opened where this has become part of the mainstream discourse. Now, is it being productive? I don't know. But again, part of living in free society is that, you know, at least let's expand, you know, the tenor of the conversation and the you know, the topics that we discuss so that, you know, we can have better ideas. All right, let's go to Kyrie and then Sam.
Yeah, I guess to chime in, I'm kind of torn on the outcomes. Just like you just mentioned, just like you and I mentioned, you know, when you take the arguments of the, you know, the 99% versus the 1%, and, you know, actively legislatively trying to work that out, it becomes very hard and extremely complicated. And I think that's just a reoccurring theme when it comes to just social justice movements, trying to basically legislate our way out of these situations. It does take a more holistic approach. I don't think raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour helps at all. There's equally sound research out there that says to abolish the minimum wage altogether. I'm not sure if I like all of these slight little, like canceling student debt. I still have student debt. I would love it canceled, of course, but I don't know how I would feel about foisting that upon other taxpayers and onto myself as well, because I'm still a taxpayer. So it's not like I'm really getting it free. I'm still paying for it over time in another form. So it's not that it gets canceled or it goes away. It doesn't go away. The language that we use, because it gets reiterated in the media, it becomes real to us. So it's like, oh, that's canceled, it's gone. No, it's still there. the loan has to be paid back. That's no denying that. It's a lot of things I think would have to be, you have to do both, and that's my one big criticism, is that we don't look holistically, as in culturally, at a lot of these problems. A lot of things that they're asking the government to do, whereas just going back to the Tea Party instance, where they have the same resentment, but coming from their point of view, it's more so communal, it's more so self-acting. It's kind of starting very small, and it is kind of incremental, but it's more local than anything, than trying to force big overhauling change, which yes, may feel good, or even in the long run, if you do kind of slow march to institutions, feel good, just like this raise in minimum wage. But what are the effects? That the inflation is, and especially when you couple it with other economic activity that we're going through now. So inflation is going through the roof, and so this $15 an hour doesn't really mean much. On top of that, the dollar itself, period, doesn't really mean much these days. So it's kind of this mixed bag of successes and voting those with the progressive agenda kind of left over into power. You know, I still see people walking around with Occupy Wall Street shirts every now and then. I don't know, it's mixed, and kind of like what you said, at least we are having a conversation that is what you prefer in society. Is it productive? Not too sure. Jury's still out now.
Right, that's a good point. And speaking of whether if the public discourse is productive or not, again, for the first time in my memory, the public debate was on this topic of class warfare. And I think some who are Occupy sympathizers would say, yeah, we need to resent those who are successful and those who are rich. And I'm just not sure if that's the right productive way to frame the public discourse, because if you have a system where there's no incentive to be successful, and yeah, success ultimately leads to some wealth, okay, then I think we might become a very kind of a backwards economy. So, you know, there is a place for success to be rewarded and respected, because otherwise it's very counterproductive.
Yeah,
All right,
nothing good comes out of resentment, if you ask me. Absolutely nothing can come out of resentment.
Okay, let's see, we got Sam and then Lorraine.
Thanks, Thomas. I guess you mentioned University of California. So the tuition there has gone up. I just looked. Basically, I was paying back in 1990. I was paying about 7 times less than what I would pay today. 7 times. So I guess to Mari's point, you know, when you were going to school, like it was, or like renting a studio, the cost of living and the cost of tuition was incredibly low. You know, sort of, you can't really, there's absolutely no comparison, you know, in terms of you know, saying that there's a way, you know, like if you could pick up yourself by your bootstraps, or, you know, that's like a, I mean, I'm sorry, but that's sort of like a really just an American boomer mindset that's kind of totally out of touch with reality today. I mean, there's breakdown in the educational system and the health system and the sort of military procurement system, and you know, sort of, there's so many sort of things that have gone wrong. And I mean, no one's addressing the real issue here. Is just the cost control at the college level, and sort of the reining in the kind of financial system, kind of like, you know, the usury kind of loan shark system, kind of feasting over the students, and kind of like you know, students being really sold this notion that they should pay you know, those kind of ridiculous amounts to graduate and make sort of a really small salaries. I guess the ratio of my first salary out of college versus the tuition I was paying was about about 7 times higher. And today, basically the ratio between the annual tuition that an out-of-state student at the University of California versus his or her first job is it's going to make less than what he was paying in tuition, which is about $48,000 if you include the health cost. So there is, this has to be addressed. Sort of there is so many problems that fundamentally have to address that have contributed to the hardships that young people are experiencing in the United States, and in overall the decline of in purchasing power, and the level of wealth concentration in the last 30 years, like nearly all the wealth has been siphoned off. And that's kind of a phenomenon that didn't happen before in the United States, like never happened before. Maybe it might have happened a little bit in the 1920s, but not even to the same extent that it's happening today. So, if you look at the distribution, the wealth distribution, compared to, I'm looking at a table of median wealth. United States is not even in the top 25 countries in the world, and the spread between the median and the mean is one of the highest in the world, which kind of indicates that there is a real sort of incredible concentration of wealth that is kind of really not conducive to a very well functioning society. There's also a huge amount of passivity on sort of in terms of student activism and young people sort of being organized and sort of fighting back. I live in Canada, in Quebec. Here, basically tuitions are the lowest on the continent. It costs about $1,400 to attend school for 1 year of tuition. We're talking about good schools like McGill, or their equivalent in the French system. The reason it is so low is because the state, sort of the province, tried to raise tuition back in 2010, and there was something like 40,000 students taking the streets, and they backed down. So there's none of this going on in the United States today, and that is sort of like a part of the reason. So it's kind of staggering, given the sort of incredible economic forces that young people face in the United States today, that there isn't really anything in terms of an organized protest movement going on.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Just a quick response regarding college tuition. I think you make a good point about, yes, there are some predatory practices, but if you just use the simple, principle of supply and demand, I think what's really fueling one of the factors that fuel the increase in college tuition is because this notion of, achieving the American dream, where everyone needs a college education to advance their career. And maybe it's time to kind of rethink that. Maybe, not everyone needs a traditional 4-year degree to do well in their career. And I think that kind of mindset, in my opinion, also ushered in, the foreclosure crisis too, because if you just look at the time period of like 2002 until 2008, this whole idea that every American deserves to own a home, I think that mindset was certainly counterproductive. And I think that's what really allowed the predatory subprime lending practices to become popular. So, maybe, we could learn from these lessons where the conventional way of home ownership, education, maybe it's time to rethink it. So another way to look at it. All right, we're almost out of time, but I do want to get 3 more comments in before we wrap it up. So we have Lorraine, Tara, and then Marty.
Yeah, I wanted to just touch on a few things, but the main thing is what I don't think I've heard tonight is that all the politicians take money from big corporations, and for that reason, they're indebted to them in order to stay elected or to get reelected. So as long as that's going on, we can never expect to really see politicians making any significant changes that alter what the corporations do. When money is given to corporations and there's no strings attached, no guidelines, or what they do is just buy back shares or whatever they do to increase the profits to their shareholders. And for that, they reward their CEOs very well. That whole system is just hand in hand with the politicians. Until we have some kind of campaign reform, finance reform, I don't think anything can change. And I don't think it's really changing the economy so much as freeing people who are elected from being indebted to these big corporations or interest groups. So that's something that just hasn't, and I just, when people say that the corporations, are paying their share, I just don't believe that that's true. They get huge tax breaks. They take advantage of huge international tax breaks. They have a whole playbook of things that they do that that the average person cannot do to cut back on their own taxes. And again, there isn't any crackdown on that. So those things aren't going to change anytime soon until that, to me, campaign finance reform is one of the main roots of the problem.
Right, that's a good point. So just to kind of illustrate some of the points that we talked about in terms of similarities and differences of Occupy and Tea Party, I think both camps would agree that there should be no corporate bailouts. Bad. Crony capitalism. Bad. There should be term limits for the elected officials, especially in Congress. Both sides could agree to that. So again, there's a lot of, I think if you were to draw a Venn diagram, there's some commonality there. I think where there is a difference, and Lorraine just alluded to it, which is campaign finance reform, because everything is really under this rubric of Citizens United framework, where now the super PACs could spend unlimited funds. So I think that's where we might run into some disagreement, because those who are conservative tend to make a free speech argument, whereas those on the progressive side try to get money out of politics, especially the dark money, so to speak, which is unaccounted for. So again, therein lies why sometimes it's hard to bring these changes about because of these differences. That's a good point. Okay, let's go to Tara next.
Hi. I just wanted to say, someone had mentioned in the chat, let me just make sure I'm correct, Kay Davis, whomever you are, I agree with you. These degrees are useless these days. The problem is, much as somebody was saying earlier, I graduated in 2012. So I got to go to college right before the bubble popped during the election. And so it is mind-boggling that you would think it is okay to continue to burden people with debt, knowing that A, their degrees are useless in the economy that they came out in. B, the cost of tuition, somebody had mentioned it earlier, has skyrocketed to astronomical proportions. There's no reason anybody should be paying $20,000 or the equivalent of someone's salary for the year to attend college at a state school. There's absolutely no reason for that, because state schools are funded by our taxes. And so the fact that state schools, you have to pay to go to them is, again, also crazy. I understand paying from out of state because you don't contribute to that, but for someone in the state to have to pay to attend a state university or a state community college or the city college where they live, and their taxes contribute to running, it's just, that's wild. Also, I wish that people had this exact same energy for corporations that don't pay their taxes, as been proven repeatedly. We've repeatedly people like Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, AOC, et cetera, have pulled the receipts, if you will, on corporations like Netflix, even though we all love it, Amazon, even though we all use it, that do not pay their fair share of taxes. As you were saying earlier, Thomas, the effective tax rate of these corporations is sometimes in the single digits, not even in the double, like that. Sometimes they're in the single digits. And so to ignore that in the face of just saying, well, you signed for it, so you should just take it on. I understand people should pay their debts, and I do understand that there is a larger issue, as Thomas was speaking about, of exactly how to, if you will, quote unquote, cancel student loan debt. Would it be a one-time thing? Would it be something recurring? Would it, and also that ties into other conversations around making education more accessible, more affordable, possibly free in some instances. But I just wish we had the same smoke, if you will, or the same like fire for these corporations and these billionaires and millionaires who abuse the loopholes that were put in place for the middle class, that were put in place for poor people to try to work their way up out of, you know, unfortunate circumstances financially into maybe being lower or up, or, you know, just straight up middle class. I just wish that we had the same fire for those people, because they blatantly in our faces tell us that they do not pay taxes, and we clap. Yay, they're so smart. Yay, they're so smart at being able to finesse the system. That's not, no. When they finesse the system, we all lose. We cut taxes for them, and then we wonder why suddenly 2 years later we have no money, or we're running, or we have a $1.5 trillion or something that we cannot afford. Why? Because we cut taxes for people who didn't need their taxes cut. The idea that cutting their taxes is going to suddenly make them create jobs and all of this other, it has been 40 years of it. It has not worked. At what point do we finally cry uncle and say, okay, let's try something different? At what point do we do that? It is very clear that these people take their money and they buy back their stocks and they give themselves giant bonuses. They cut jobs, they cut benefits to their workers, they rake in mad dough, and people just clap and say, well, you know, that's how the game is played. The game does not have to be played that way. The game does not have to be played that way. And one of the biggest things is we have to take money out of politics, because the fact that they can lobby people with money and send checks, the fact that Exxon can send a check to Joe Manchin on a regular basis and get him to vote how they want him to vote, even though overwhelmingly he is in the opposite position of the American people, is insane. So those need to be the conversations. Those are the things that Occupy Wall Street was talking about. Let's get money out of politics. Let's stop letting people on Wall Street decide policies that affect their businesses. You want to talk about that's a conflict of interest. Sorry for rambling.
Interesting points, Tara. Thanks. Just to follow up on Tara's point, and we'll go to Marty. Look, there is some overlap between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. And what's interesting about the last, I guess, a decade or so in US politics is that for most of my lifetime, the conservatives were all about free market, laissez-faire system, where you know, there was more like the Paul Ryan way of governing, where it was all about budget cuts, tax cuts, austerity, and let free market reign and prosper. And I think for the first time in my lifetime, economic populism has gained some traction, even amongst conservatives. You look at a lot of the ballot questions in these red states, whether it's Alaska, Missouri, they have these ballot initiatives on minimum wage increase. And in the red states, they overwhelmingly support minimum wage increase. So someone had mentioned before about how some of these voters in the red states, sometimes they vote against their interests because in the name of kind of partisan dogma, they just, you know, check the box, but sometimes I think their elected officials may not be serving them in their best interests. So this is a very interesting phenomenon. And I think this overlap of, you know, Bernie Sanders movement with the populism that we saw in Donald Trump, that would not have happened other than, you know, the advent of Occupy and the Tea Party. And that was the product of the economic anxieties of 2008 financial crisis. That's my theory. Okay, let's go to Marty, and then we got to wrap it up.
Okay, thank you. So a few things. First, a few weeks ago, I was looking at a chart showing how things have been affected by inflation, and the cost of education was way on top. It beat all the other things hands down. The price seems to go up exponentially or something. And personally, I think it's because of all the government funding going to tuition, student loans and grants to schools, and just the government support of schools. And so government money tends to be easy to come by for education, and so that boosts up the cost. And so get government out of education is my solution. I do agree with something you said, Thomas, regarding that college, I think you said this, college, or at least I'll say it, college is highly overrated. And I have a master's degree. I'm not anti-education, but yeah, I think many people could do very well without it, going into plumbing or mechanical things, electrical things. I don't know about you, but if I call a plumber, get your wallet out. It's going to be empty. So these guys make a good living. I'm all for it. But you don't need a college education for everything or to make a decent living here in America. And Sam mentioned that I was out of touch because I implied pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and I know that many liberals or people on the left really like to ridicule the philosophy of pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I'd like to recommend to all those who do so to read one of my favorite books and one of my favorite American heroes, Booker T. Washington, Up from Slavery. What an amazing, miraculous, wonderful man. and what he was able to accomplish, literally being born into slavery. And he did it all without government help. He achieved all his successes without government aid. And his book is very thin, very easy to read, and it's really inspirational, and it's terrific. So please read that book. And then Sam, after you read that book, come tell me about being out of touch. In terms, another way for people to get their education paid for is a lot of corporations will pay for your education. Go to work for them, and the salary might not be the greatest, but they'll pay for your school. That's another way to do it if you don't want to go into the military and get the GI Bill, which I think is perfectly legitimate and decent way to go. In terms of corporations not paying taxes, of course some do, some don't. Remember, the reason that the tax rate was lowered for corporations is so they wouldn't go overseas, and because in European
still
countries,
Sorry, I just want to, in real time, they still did. So
some
it didn't work,
do, some
no.
don't. It's a mixed bag. There are still other advantages to working overseas, so they do so. But it's not cut and dry as you're making it. And either way, for those that do pay zero taxes, the stockholders still pay taxes. So all this time, for as long as I can remember, corporations have been complaining about double taxation because on the corporate level, they have to pay tax, and then the stockholder has to pay tax. So that's double taxation. So if a corporation is, quote, paying zero tax, the stockholder is still paying tax. So they're still getting dinged one way or another. By the way, I'm opposed to taxes. I'm opposed to income taxes. I support consumption tax. And it's a great website called The Fair Tax. I hope people will take a look at it and consider it. Let's see. Also, so Thomas, I think you said that, you know, we really didn't talk about taxes until 2008. But, you know, under Reagan, for example, in the 1980s, he was famous for giving the rich a huge tax cut, which, by the way, I opposed because prior to Reagan, the disparity between the rich and the poor was 20-1. After Reagan's 8 years, I think it was 80-1. And today, I think it's 300-1. So clearly, there's a problem. You know, people are not going to be at peace, but I'm not at peace with it, and I'm a libertarian, you know, and it bothers me. It tells me there's something wrong somewhere in the system. To me, the biggest problem is the stockholder is no longer voting on the corporation's policies and about how much the CEOs and everybody should be getting paid. Who's doing all the voting now are the people who own the stocks, and that's pension funds and mutual funds. You know, they own hundreds of thousands of shares. They don't care how much the CEO is getting paid as long as the returns look good. And so I think that's the heart of the problem there, because before that we could say, no, you know, you're not going to get paid no $500,000 or $1 million or $65 million, all these obscene numbers that they're, you know, some of these people are getting paid. I don't mind people like, you know, the people who find, you know, who really create companies and become billionaires as a result of it. You know, I don't have a problem with them becoming billionaires, you know, but down the chain, as these people pass away and they get all these CEOs, and, you know, they're getting these inflated salaries and their performance isn't all that great. It just doesn't make sense to me. Okay, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Marty. And I know, Tara, you have your hand up, but we're simply out of time.
Oh, no worries. My apologies. I didn't mean to do that.
That's okay. But it was a fascinating conversation. Thank you, everyone, for your inputs. And we look forward to seeing you again next time. Thanks,
Okay, thank you, Thomas.
Take care.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Thomas.
you. Bye.